Well, thank you so much for folks getting on and dealing with this issue. For me, I'm a lawyer, and I've litigated about conditions inside of solitary confinement. And for 14 years, I monitored conditions inside those prisons at the Correctional Association. And I knew that from all this experience, actually talking to probably 1,000 people in solitary confinement over my career, that this was very harmful. And so what we wanted to, the purpose of this report is to document what the advocates and the family members and everyone else knows, that there's a huge problem. But the problem is even more severe than maybe we thought. New York has an epidemic of self-harm. And it really is, think of it as a mountain. We go with self-inflicted injuries, suicide attempts, and then suicides, death by suicide at the top. But it is clearly a mountain, and the situation in solitary is an epidemic. What we found is that we looked at data from 2015 through 2019 for suicides, and we actually had the names of almost everyone there, and we could analyze what was going on. And the rate of suicide for people dying by suicide in some form of isolation was 5 times the rate in the rest of the prisons. 5 times. That is not something that can be ignored, and it's not something that's just an aberrant number. You can't have that many times the rate of elsewhere when there's one particular factor. It means that solitary is the cause of the harm. And we really demonstrated that. In particular, we looked at who died by suicide. And the people that died in solitary were different than the people elsewhere. Namely, people are dying that should not be dying. 50% of the people were in their 20s, and as Dr. Lee just described, still developing. And the trauma of isolation is even greater for them. And that number was very different, more than twice the number of suicides elsewhere. There's also almost 2/3 of the people are people of color, and that is much higher than it was in the rest of the prison. And again, it's because, first of all, who gets in there and the trauma that's associated with that. And there is also distinction, people that were from 1 to 5 years in the prison who generally do not commit suicide, at more twice that rate they're committing suicide there. The overall impact of this report is that people who are dying in solitary are people that probably would not have committed suicide, but would not have died by suicide, but for this isolation, this harm. And we know it's there. I have to say, on a personal note, I've interviewed so many people who are harming themselves, and suicide, death by suicide, is just the ultimate act of that. And so I want to go to the next piece. The next piece is that we are seeing unbelievable high levels of suicide attempts, particularly in solitary. That is the number that is 12 times the rate elsewhere. And so what we actually have seen is that people are harming themselves over and over again in solitary as a cry for help. If you take suicide attempts and also self-inflicted injuries, literally there was harm in the prison more than once a day if you put both those groups together. And what we see in many of these stories, and these are real people that are dying, we're seeing that they often have repeated episodes of self-harm, and they would be sent to a crisis center in the prison, but sent right back to the same environment. So my point of all of that is, this is very predictable. The department knows this is happening. Office of Mental Health knows it's happening, and they're allowing it to go forward because they're not addressing the problem. The problem is not some crisis intervention. The problem is the environment. You're taking people and sending them right back to the toxic environment, and they lose hope and they take their lives. And we have to do something about it. Second point is, this is preventable. The interventions that they are doing, which is saying, oh, we'll send them to a crisis center, does not address the underlying problem. The underlying problem is solitary. And that's why we have been pressing for the HALT Solitary Confinement Act. We know the only way to stop this self-harm is to end solitary. And that's why HALT needs to pass, and it needs to pass right away. Thank you.